Burkina Faso Burkina Faso is no longer dealing with just another series of attacks. What the country is facing now is a major shift in the way pressure is being applied, and that shift is becoming increasingly significant. Recent operations connected to the JNIM have struck multiple regions within very short periods, hitting security positions and strategic routes almost at the same time. That kind of coordination is not accidental. When attacks unfold in this manner, the first thing that begins to weaken is not the territory itself, but the system's ability to respond effectively. Security units are deployed towards one crisis, only to be redirected before they even arrive, because another situation suddenly emerges elsewhere. Decisions are made but rapidly lose relevance as conditions change in real time. Nothing is fully resolved before the next challenge appears. The state remains standing and there is no confirmed collapse, but something important has clearly changed. The system is now being focused to respond on multiple fronts simultaneously. That raises the real question: is this simply a temporary escalation, or is it part of a calculated strategy designed to stretch the system beyond its operational limits? To truly understand what is happening, each attack can no longer be viewed as an isolated event. The key is in how these incidents connect. Individually, none of them fully explains the wider situation. Together, however, they reveal a clear operational pattern. In early periods, attacks will occur, forces will respond, and despite the difficulties, there was still a sequence to events. One crisis could be addressed before another demanded urgent attention. That sequence allowed the system to recover and regain stability after every confrontation. But that balance is now being disrupted. What is emerging instead is overlap. A response operation begins in one location, and before it is completed, another attack surfaces elsewhere. Not afterward, but during the ongoing response itself. That creates a difficult choice: continue forward and risk ignoring the new threat, or redirect resources and leave the original mission unfinished. Neither option offers a complete solution, and that appears to be the objective. Once responses become incomplete, pressure begins expanding beyond the initial incident, and one unresolved problem leads directly into another, forcing the system to carry several crises at the same time. This is not simply about the strength of any single attack. It is about the effects that those attacks have on the state's response structure. Rather than resolving one issue after another, the system is pushed into constant reaction mode, continuously adjusting, constantly interrupted, and rarely being able to fully complete what it starts. Over time, this creates operational fatigue, not physical exhaustion alone, but strategic and organizational fatigue. Decisions become heavier, movements become cautious, and every action requires greater calculation because another threat is already developing elsewhere. This is where the real pressure begins to grow. The system does not necessarily collapse or fall outright, but it gradually starts falling behind. And then, when responses are consistently one step late, each new incident becomes more difficult to contain than the last. The central point becomes clear. This is not random violence. It reflects a broader pattern aimed at disrupting and overloading the response process itself. And once constant interruption becomes the norm, another important question emerges. If this pressure is coordinated in time, why is it also spread across multiple regions? The geographic spread matters more than it first appears. If all the attacks were concentrated in a single area, the response would be more straightforward: reinforce the region, deploy additional forces, contain the threat, and slowly restore stability. But when incidents appear across different regions simultaneously, the situation becomes far more complex, stretching resources, attention, and decision-making capacity across the entire system at once. That entire model relies on one critical factor: focus. But focus is exactly what this new pattern is designed to destroy. When attacks are spread across multiple regions, the system loses its stability. The system loses its ability to concentrate forces effectively. Instead of overwhelming one area with full strength, it is forced to divide attention and resources across several hotspots at once. Divided coverage is always weaker than concentrated control. Resources are no longer being applied decisively in a single location. They are stretched across multiple urgent situations, each demanding immediate attention, yet none being fully resolved. Distance only makes the situation worse. Moving forces from one region to another is not instant. It takes time. And while units are still in transit, the situation in the original location continues evolving while another incident is already unfolding elsewhere. That changes the nature of control entirely. The system is no longer controlling territory in a stable way, it is chasing instability from one place to another, constantly moving but never fully catching up. That is not the real impact to this geographical spread. Not total collapse, not immediate territorial loss, but a gradual erosion of focus. From the outside, things may still appear stable. There is no obvious sign of complete breakdown. State structures remain intact. Security forces are still operating, but internally, something important has shifted. Instead of deciding where and when to act, the system is increasingly being forced to react wherever pressure suddenly appears. And once a system is reacting everywhere at once, it is no longer fully controlling anywhere. That is where the trap begins. Because once focus disappears, delays start multiplying. A slightly delayed response in one area creates a larger problem elsewhere. That larger problem then demands more attention, which creates another gap in another region. Pressure spreads across the system without any single dramatic collapse ever taking place. This is no longer simply about holding territory. It is about forcing the system to lose concentration across the territory. And once concentration is weakened, another factor becomes even more critical: speed. If forces are stretched thin and focus is compromised, then their ability to move quickly becomes the only thing keeping the system functional. Rapid response becomes essential. If units can still move fast enough, pressure can be managed. But once movement slows, even slightly, the entire response structure is weakened. And that appears to be exactly where the pressure is now being applied. Not necessarily to stop movement completely, but to slow it down just enough to create cumulative strain. That difference is crucial, because once movement slows, every stage of the response process begins shifting out of alignment. Convoys take longer to arrive, reinforcements reach conflict zones later than expected. Situations that might have been contained early are allowed more time to develop. And when the crisis grows larger, it naturally demands more manpower, more resources, and more attention to control. The additional effort is then pulled from somewhere else, creating another delay in another location. This is how time itself becomes a weapon. Not through one catastrophic disruption, but through a chain of smaller delays that gradually compounds into larger systemic pressure. It works like a shadow that continuously slips behind. One delay seems manageable at first, but when delays keep repeating, the entire structure slowly falls out of rhythm. That is the situation unfolding now. The system is still functioning, security units are still deploying, responses are still happening, but they are arriving later than they need to. And in security operations, timing changes everything. Controls depend on acting before a situation escalates, not after it has already expanded. Once responses consistently arrive late, the system loses its ability to stay ahead of events. It stops shaping the situation and starts reacting to it instead. The posture becomes reactive rather than proactive. And when that shift takes hold, every new incident creates even greater pressure than the one before. So this strategy is not necessarily about shutting the system down completely. It is about forcing the system to operate behind the clock, constantly trying to catch up, and once a system remains permanently one step behind, the next question becomes unavoidable. If responses are always arriving slightly too late, what happens to the sense of control on the ground? If response continues arriving even slightly late, control does not suddenly disappear, but it begins to change in character. From the outside, the structure may still appear stable. There is no dramatic collapse. Authority remains in place, security forces are still active, and officially, the system continues to function. But on the ground, the reality starts to feel different. Because control is not defined by presence alone, it depends on timing, confidence, and the ability to stay ahead of events. When responses arrive quickly, threats are contained before they grow larger. That creates a sense of order and stability because people feel the system is operating ahead of the crisis. But once responses begin arriving later than expected, even by small margins, that balance slowly shifts. Incidents last longer before being controlled. Situations develop further before interventions becomes effective. And that creates uncertainty. Not because control has vanished, but because it no longer feels immediate or decisive. Over time, that uncertainty begins spreading throughout the system itself. Security units become more cautious in their movements. Operations are planned more carefully. Decisions take longer because commanders must weigh more variables before acting. These adjustments are logical, but they come with consequences. They slow the system down even further. This is how a cycle begins. Slower response creates more cautious decision making. More cautious decision making reduces operational speed. Reduced speed creates larger delays, and larger delays increase pressure across multiple regions at once. The system does not collapse, but it creates heavier, more difficult to move rapidly, and harder to maintain the same level of consistent control everywhere simultaneously. That is the deeper shift taking place. Control still exists, but it's no longer absolute or dominant. It becomes conditional. In some areas, responses remain rapid and effective. In others, they become slower, more measured, and less decisive. And once control becomes uneven, every new incident begins testing the system in different ways. So the issue is no longer whether control exists. The issue is whether control can remain consistent under sustained pressure. And once that consistency begins to weaken, attention naturally shifts beyond individual attacks and towards a larger question. Who is responsible for restoring balance before the pressure grows further? That is where Ibrahim Traoré becomes central to the discussion. Leadership in situations like this is not judged by whether attacks occur. In a conflict environment, incidents are expected. What matters is how leadership responds when the nature of pressure itself begins to evolve. And that is precisely what appears to be happening now. Traoré's leadership has been strongly associated with one major expectation: restoring stability and reinforcing state control in Burkina Faso. The expectations remain, but the environment surrounding it has changed significantly. This is no longer a situation where direct force alone is enough to solve the problem. The pressure is now operating on multiple levels at once: timing, geographical spread, and operational speed. Each create a different form of strain. Combined, they produce a far more complex challenge than isolated attacks alone. And complex challenges require adaptation. That is the real test unfolding here. Not simply whether the system can respond, but whether it can evolve the way it responds. Because when pressure changes while strategy remains the same, the gap between the two begins to widen. And that widening gap is where systemic strain starts to accumulate. It appears slower, reactions more difficult, operational choices, and growing allegiance in maintaining equal control across multiple regions. These are not signs of immediate failure, but they are indicators that the system is being pushed into a different operational environment. In moments like this, leadership is expected to recognize the shift early, identify the broader pattern, and adapt strategy before the pressure becomes harder to manage. Once a pattern becomes visible, repeating the same response is no longer enough. The expectation becomes proactive rather than reactive. The focus shifts from handling isolated incidents to addressing the structure and strategy behind them. This is no longer just a security issue. It is becoming a broader test of whether leadership can adapt quickly enough to match a changing form of pressure with a changing form of response. And that leads directly to the final question. If this pressure continues evolving in the same direction over time, what does the situation eventually become? If this pressure continues in its current form, it is likely to cause an immediate collapse. Instead, it creates something slower, deeper, and far more difficult to reverse: the gradual exhaustion of the system itself. What appears to be unfolding is not a strategy aimed at quick victory. It is a strategy designed to force part of the system to operate under continuous strain for extended periods of time, not destroying it in a single moment, but by ensuring it remains under constant pressure without relief. When responses consistently overlap, the security forces are repeatedly shifted between regions, and when decisions must continuously be made under urgency, the system begins carrying a permanent operational burden, and over time, the burden accumulates. Each delay feeds into the next. Every adjustment creates another layer of complexity. Gradually, the system becomes less flexible, not necessarily because it is weak, but because it is permanently occupied. And a system that is constantly occupied loses its ability to think ahead effectively. That is a deeper long consequence. The issue is no longer simply about maintaining control. It becomes about maintaining initiative. And initiative matters because the side that controls initiative shapes the direction of events. The side that loses initiative is forced into constant reaction, responding to situations that have already developed instead of preventing them before they emerge. That is where the real danger begins to appear. If the system remains trapped in a reactive posture for too long, even relatively small pressures can begin to feel much larger over time. Not necessarily because those pressures are becoming stronger, but because the system itself has less room left to absorb them. That is how gradual strain slowly evolves into a much larger strategic problem. So, the final point becomes clear. This is not a strategy built around immediate victory. It is a long-term pressure strategy designed to wear the system down slowly by keeping it in a state of continuous reaction. And that leaves one final question. Can Ibrahim Traoré and the system around him regain the initiative before the pressure becomes permanent? Let us know in the comment sections what you think Traoré should do next.